Scorpio. It feels like it's been a long time since you've been holding everything inside yourself. And what's strange is, the more you try to stay composed, the heavier everything underneath seems to get. The cards showing up this week aren't pointing toward anything loud or dramatic. It feels more like that quiet moment when someone finally starts realizing they can't keep living in this constant state of just pushing through anymore, just surviving, just holding it together. I feel like this is a very particular time for Scorpio. Not because everything suddenly gets easier, but because something inside you starts to want to move differently, very quietly, very honestly. And sometimes, the thing that changes the entire direction ahead doesn't begin with something big at all. It starts with a very small decision, one you haven't really allowed yourself to make before. Scorpio. It feels like it's been quite a long time since you've been holding yourself in a state of always being ready to endure just a little more. One more day, one more responsibility, one more silence you had to carry. On the outside, things might still look like they're functioning normally. You still show up. You still respond to people. You still get everything done that needs to get done. But there's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in the body. It feels more like sitting in a car for too long after the engine has already been turned off, watching red traffic lights reflect across the windshield, while your mind never really comes to a stop. And maybe that's why the energy in the cards this week feels heavier underneath everything. The Tower card doesn't show up as a sudden collapse. It feels more like someone who's been holding everything together for so long that even the silence itself starts to push back from the inside. And Scorpio, you've always been very good at that. You can walk into a room with a completely calm face, while inside your mind you've already gone through 100 conversations you never said out loud. The Nine of Swords card in this reading doesn't feel like panic. It feels like waking up too early, sitting alone in a 24-hour diner, coffee gone cold without you even noticing, and realizing for the first time you've been living in just getting through it mode for so long that you've forgotten what real rest even feels like. There's death cards sitting right in the middle of this energy. And what's important here is, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like the moment someone simply no longer has the energy to keep being the version of themselves they've been surviving as. Not because they're weaker, but because the protective layers that once helped them survive are starting to feel like they're making it harder to breathe. The King of Cups card comes in very quietly here. No noise, no drama. It feels like someone sitting in an almost empty parking lot after hours. Hands resting on the steering wheel, not checking music playing, just sitting there for a few extra minutes before stepping into yet another role they have to play in life. And maybe what's been most exhausting for Scorpio isn't the emotions themselves. It's having to constantly control them so no one else ever sees them. There are people who are so used to you being strong, always composed, always knowing what to do, that slowly you start believing you're not allowed to soften anymore. But this reading doesn't feel like it's trying to break everything apart. It feels more like a very small crack finally appearing after years of holding everything so tightly in place. And sometimes, a small crack is exactly where air starts to get in. I don't think Scorpio needs to hold on tighter right now. You've already been doing that for too long. What might be shifting here is simply the first moment, where you start to wonder if you really need to keep holding on like this at all. And that feeling might be where everything quietly begins to move. It's not the kind of change that other people notice right away, not a sudden turn, not a dramatic shift, not a moment where you suddenly become someone completely different. It's much smaller than that, more like a moment when someone is driving on a highway just before sunrise, and for the first time in a long time, they don't take the familiar route. Just one small turn. But even in that moment, there's this quiet awareness that if they kept going down the same path for a few more months, a few more years, they would slowly keep becoming the version of themselves that has already been exhausted for so long. And I think that's the kind of energy coming through very clearly with the Ace of Wands card. It's not explosive, not dramatic. It feels more like a very quiet thought that appears right when the mind finally starts to settle. Something like, maybe I don't actually have to keep living like this anymore. And what's interesting is, Scorpio doesn't usually change when things reach their worst point. You tend to change when the silence inside becomes too heavy to carry. When continuing to endure starts feeling more exhausting than actually stepping into something different. That may be why the Fool card shows up in such a different way here. Not naive, not reckless. It feels more like standing inside an elevator in a hotel, watching the numbers slowly change floor by floor, knowing that when those doors open, you're about to step into a version of life you've been postponing for a long time. And no one is forcing you. That's what makes it harder. Scorpio is often incredibly strong in crisis. You handle pressure well, you adapt, you survive. But sometimes, that same ability to endure is what keeps you inside situations long after you've already outgrown them. A job, a relationship, a way of living, a version of yourself. The Knight of Pentacles card here feels very slow. Not slow because of laziness, but because when someone has lived in survival mode for too long, even choosing something for themselves can feel unfamiliar, almost like it carries a strange sense of guilt. Like sitting in a 24-hour laundromat, watching the same cycle spin over and over again, and suddenly realizing your life has been a very similar kind of exhaustion for much longer than you thought. The same silence, the same tension, the same reaction. And maybe Scorpio has started to feel tired of always being the one who holds everything together. Not because you've become weaker, but because there are phases in life when a person no longer wants to spend all of their energy on defense. The Magician card shows up here in a very different way. It doesn't feel like manifesting. It doesn't feel like trying to create a perfect life. It feels more like the moment someone finally realizes, I actually have the right to choose a different way of living, to say what they truly think, to slow down, to stop pleasing everyone around them. And sometimes, that is the hardest step for Scorpio, not breaking everything apart, but allowing yourself to want more than what you've been settling for. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes when someone begins to change for real, because the people who are used to your old version may not fully understand the one that's starting to emerge. But I think Scorpio has felt that for a while already. Like something inside you has already started to stand up, even if nothing outside has fully caught up yet. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you're not just trying to get through another day anymore. You're starting to want to live a little differently. And the truth is, that's often the moment Scorpio feels the most fear. Not when everything falls apart, not when life turns chaotic, but when, deep inside, there's finally a quiet desire to feel lighter. Because when you've been used to living in a constant state of defense, letting go of control can sometimes feel more threatening than simply staying exhausted. And I think that's why this energy feels so still. Not as tense as before, but not fully peaceful yet either. It's like someone sitting in a kitchen very early in the morning. The sky still not fully awake, a TV softly playing in another room. And for the first time in months, maybe years, they don't feel like thinking anymore. Not because everything has been solved, but because the body itself is starting to resist being in a constant state of alert. The Eight of Cups card in this reading feels more like a memory than a card, like the feeling of walking away from a place you stayed in far too long, not because love disappeared, but because you finally realized you turned endurance into your identity. And Scorpio, you're very capable of doing that. You can adapt to almost anything. A situation that drains you, a relationship that lacks real connection, a schedule that never gives your mind rest, a version of yourself that always has to be stronger than what you actually feel. You can stay in those spaces for so long that you almost forget what it feels like to breathe normally again. The Temperance card in this part feels very different. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like a nervous system finally lowering its alarm state, like someone standing on a windy rooftop. No music playing, not talking to anyone, just standing there for a few quiet minutes and realizing their mind is not as loud today as it used to be. Maybe nothing outside has changed much yet, but inside, something in Scorpio has started to stop fighting against itself, and that is not small. The Seven of Pentacles card brings up a very specific kind of exhaustion, not the sharp kind of pain, but the kind that comes from looking back over many years and quietly wondering, have I spent so much time just surviving that I never really asked myself how I actually want to live? That's not an easy question for Scorpio, because there are people who build their entire life around their ability to endure. They are strong. They handle pressure. They stay quiet. They keep moving even when everything inside is overwhelmed. But eventually, that same strength can start to feel isolating because it separates you from yourself. The Star card comes through at the end of this energy in a very soft way, not as big hope, not as dramatic change. It feels more like someone walking slowly through a crowded street and suddenly realizing they no longer want to match the pace of everything around them. Not because they gave up, but because, for the first time, they want to move differently, slower, more honestly, with less defense. And maybe Scorpio isn't fully used to that version yet. Maybe there's still a part of you that feels like if you soften even a little, everything might slip out of control. But this reading doesn't feel like it's trying to take your strength away. It feels like it's trying to separate strength from exhaustion, because those two things are not the same. And maybe for the first time in a long while, Scorpio is beginning to understand You don't have to hurt yourself anymore just to prove that you're strong. The strange thing is, when someone has spent a long time living under constant pressure, they don't usually realize they're changing while it's happening. It doesn't arrive like a big awakening. It shows up in very small moments. Like sitting in an airport waiting area, watching flight updates constantly shift on the screen, and suddenly realizing you no longer want to keep chasing everything just to feel validated. There are kinds of exhaustion Scorpio rarely speaks about. The exhaustion of always being the understanding one, always being the calm one, always walking into every space, instinctively reading everyone else's energy before even thinking about your own. The Queen of Cups card in this part carries that exact feeling. Not fragile, not weak, but the kind of person who is finally starting to turn back toward their own emotions after spending so many years managing everyone else's emotional world. And I think Scorpio is entering that kind of phase. No longer wanting to shrink yourself just to keep the peace. No longer staying silent just to avoid conflict. No longer pretending that nothing is affecting you. Because the truth is, it always was affecting you. You are just better than most people at hiding it. The King of Cups card shows up again here in a very different way than before. This time, it doesn't feel like suppression anymore. It feels like someone standing on a moving escalator inside a crowded mall, everyone around them rushing somewhere, but for the first time, they don't feel the need to keep up with anyone else's pace. A strange kind of calm starts returning. Not numbness, not emotional shutdown, but the calm of someone who finally understands where their real value actually is. And when that happens, a lot of things start losing their grip on Scorpio. People's opinions, half-connected relationships, places where you always felt like you had to keep proving yourself. The Nine of Cups card in this reading brings a very specific kind of relief. That rare moment of exhale after a long period of emotional tension, like sitting on a rooftop with the wind moving through the city below, and finally having enough space in your mind to hear your own thoughts clearly again. And maybe that thought is something very simple. I deserve a life where I don't have to constantly shrink myself just to fit into it. The Judgment card comes in very strongly at the end of this section, not as judgment, not as karma, but more like the echo of an older version of yourself slowly fading into the distance. The version that believed you had to suffer more to be loved. You had to give up more to be accepted. You had to be the strongest person in the room just to not be left behind. But the Scorpio you are now is starting to see things differently. You're beginning to realize that someone who truly understands your value will never treat constant self-sacrifice as love. And that kind of awakening doesn't always announce itself loudly. But Scorpio will feel it. In the way you start speaking. In the way you start responding. In the way you no longer stay as long in places that drain you. On the outside, not much may look different yet. But inside, a stronger version of you is slowly starting to rise. Quietly, without permission. Just simply, no longer willing to make yourself smaller to fit into other people's worlds. And I think this is the moment where Scorpio's direction really begins to shift. Not because suddenly everything becomes clear, but because you stop betraying what you've been feeling inside. There are certain periods when Scorpio's intuition becomes extremely strong. So strong that sometimes you already know something doesn't belong in your life anymore. Long before your mind is ready to accept it. But Scorpio doesn't usually move right away. You observe, you endure, you try to understand more. You keep giving things another chance. You keep trying to convince yourself that you're still okay. Until one day, your body simply can't pretend anymore. The Eight of Wands card in this part feels exactly like that. Not chaotic, not dramatic. It feels more like a train finally starting to move again after standing still for far too long. And what's interesting is, things actually started shifting long before this moment. Scorpio just needs more time than most people to trust what they already feel deep down. That may be why this energy feels very much like movement, not running away, not leaving in anger, but something more mature than that. Like someone slowly rolling a suitcase through an airport hallway, no longer looking back to see who might still be holding them there. The Star card shows up here in a very quiet way. It doesn't feel dreamy. It feels like clarity that arrives after you've been too exhausted to keep becoming a version of yourself that no longer feels like home. And Scorpio understands that feeling more than anyone, because you can stay in a role for a very long time, even when, deep down, you've already left it emotionally. A job, a relationship, a way of loving, a way of living. You can still function perfectly on the outside, even when your heart is no longer really there. But eventually, that disconnect becomes too obvious to ignore. The Two of Wands card in this reading feels like someone standing on a hotel balcony early in the morning. The city's still not fully awake. one hand resting on the railing, and for the first time, not thinking about how to endure a little more. Instead, they're asking something different. Where do I actually want to go next? That's a very different question. And it's not one Scorpio usually allows themselves to ask honestly. Because when you've lived in survival mode for too long, you stop thinking about happiness. You stop thinking about peace. You stop thinking about what you actually want your life to look like. But this energy is slowly pulling Scorpio out of that state, quietly, without force, without noise. The Death card appears for the last time in this spread, like a door quietly closing behind you. Not painfully like before, just naturally. Like certain versions of Scorpio have already finished their role. The version that always had to be stronger than everyone else. The version that always expected the worst. The version that believed they had to carry everything alone. And maybe what's beginning now isn't about becoming someone completely new, but about finally allowing yourself to live without constantly bracing for impact. I don't think Scorpio needs to move fast in this phase, but I do think that once you fully commit to what your heart has known for a long time, things begin to shift on their own. A lot of change in life starts energetically first. And Scorpio, maybe you've already been stepping out of your old self for a while now. It's just that now, you've finally stopped walking backward. And maybe what Scorpio is learning in this phase isn't how to become stronger again, but how to live without always wearing armor. There are people who are so used to you handling pain well that they don't even realize how tired you've been for a long time. But Scorpio knows. You know what it feels like to keep everything together when you're already overwhelmed on the inside. You know what it feels like to keep moving forward even when there's barely any energy left. You know what it feels like to pull yourself through phases of life that no one else really ever sees. And maybe that's why this shift feels so important, not because it's huge, but because it finally feels real. No longer a version of you that's just surviving. No longer a version that prepares for loss before anything good can fully arrive. No longer a version that shuts down its own emotions just to feel safe. There's another Scorpio slowly beginning to emerge, quieter, more honest, less at war with everything. And the most beautiful part is, you don't have to destroy your entire life in order to become that person. Sometimes it starts with one moment of speaking your truth. One decision not to go back to what drained you. One choice to choose yourself instead of continuing to endure. Big changes rarely begin with big noise. Most of the time, it's just a quiet moment where someone decides, I don't want to live like this anymore. And I think Scorpio is getting very close to that moment. If this reading finds you at the right time, it's not here to tell you to become someone else. It's just here to remind you, you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. And maybe that's where the real journey finally begins.